From the first presidential assassination, to the first televised debate, to the first commander-in-chief dropping a nuclear bomb. This is every presidential first in U.S. history. And you might want to grab some popcorn, because these only get crazier with each president. Like George Washington, who was not only the first U.S. president, but the first and only president unanimously elected. Twice. Because Washington wasn't just another politician. He was a general who led a ragtag army against the most powerful empire on earth and won. His reputation was so massive, he could have crowned himself king. No, seriously, people offered. But Washington shocked the world when he said no to power, and this solidified him as a legend. However, when it came time to pick America's first president, the decision was automatic, because the nation dragged him back into public service and gave him back-to-back unanimous election wins. Sorry, John Adams, but at least you were the first president to live in the White House. Cause in 1800, John and Abigail Adams moved into the White House, and it was kind of a construction zone. Workers hammering, dust everywhere, and half the rooms were unfinished. But the Adams made it work. Cause Abigail famously hung laundry in the East Room, cause nothing else was in it. But the move to D.C. didn't stop with the Adams. It rolled right into Thomas Jefferson, the first president inaugurated in Washington, D.C. Before that, inaugurations bounced between New York and Philadelphia. But in 1801, Jefferson's ceremony cemented D.C. as the permanent home of the American government. A swampy little city still half under construction. Drain the swamp! Drain the swamp! And no, Jefferson didn't talk about draining the swamp, he just literally stood in one. But while the presidents got cozy in D.C., James Madison was gearing up for war. Because Madison was the first president to formally ask Congress for a declaration of war. The year was 1812, and American sailors were being bullied by British ships. And the Constitution was clear. The president couldn't just charge into battle. He needed Congress to sign off. So Madison marched into Congress and asked for it. And after a fiery debate, America was officially at war with the British Empire once again. Woohoo! Tough crowd. But the War of 1812 turned out messy, divisive, and even caused the U.S. Capitol to go up in flames. But at least Madison followed the rulebook. But speaking of legacies, what if I told you this dashing bald eagle in a suit has some royal feathers in his family tree? Thanks to MyHeritage, I uncovered ancestors that'll make your jaw drop. Because MyHeritage is the leading family history platform, trusted by over 90 million users. With access to 36 billion records and AI tools, you can uncover lost relatives, build your family tree, and even bring old photos back to life. Basically, it's like carving your own family tree onto Mount Rushmore without all the dynamite. And I wasn't expecting much, but within minutes, I discovered some wild history. My great-great-grand eagle, Sir Beakington III, once guarded George Washington's hat. Aunt Featherina immigrated to America as a corn inspector. And Franklin Four Talons Flappy, well, he once won a pie-eating contest against 3 turkeys and a raccoon. That's the kind of grit you just can't teach. But these weren't just old names on a page. MyHeritage brought them to life with enhanced photos and forgotten documents. Because my favorite feature is photo colorization. MyHeritage took an old photo of my grandfather, Colonel Flappadoo, and made him blink and smirk like he just won re-election. And with instant discoveries, one click added entire branches to my tree. Names and faces I never knew existed, all appearing instantly. So if you've ever wondered about your own story, well, now's the time. MyHeritage is offering a 14-day free trial. Just click the link in the description or pinned comment. And in seconds, you could uncover long-lost relatives, bring old photos to life, and maybe even learn you've got a presidential past. Your history is waiting, so go claim it. Meanwhile, James Monroe was the first president to ride a steamboat. And although it was a short trip down the Potomac, it symbolized something bigger. America chugging into the Industrial Revolution. 'Cause Monroe's presidency was literally called the Era of Good Feelings. A time of optimism, growth, and national pride. And hey, who wouldn't be happy cruising on a steamboat? But the cool inventions kept rolling with John Quincy Adams, who was the first president ever photographed. Cause in 1843, years after his presidency, Quincy Adams posed for a daguerreotype, a new experimental photographic process. And it resulted in this photo, a stern old John Quincy Adams mean mugging the camera. Looking sharp, sir. But the fun times didn't last forever, because Andrew Jackson was the first president to face an assassination attempt. In 1835, Jackson was leaving a funeral when a man named Richard Lawrence pulled out a pistol, aimed, and misfired. He quickly pulled out a second pistol and misfired again. That's when Old Hickory lived up to his nickname. Cause the 70-year-old Jackson beat Lawrence with a cane until bystanders dragged the guy away. What a legend! On the other hand, Martin Van Buren was unique in his own way, because he was the first president to speak English as a second language. Born into a Dutch community in New York, little Martin grew up speaking Dutch at home, then picked up English later. And although it didn't play a major role in his political life, it did reflect just how diverse some early pockets of America already were. Meanwhile, William Henry Harrison loved speaking English because his inauguration address went on for nearly 2 hours, one of the longest yap fests in presidential history. But after drinking contaminated drinking water at the White House, Harrison became the first president to die in office. And that created a full-blown constitutional crisis, because nobody knew if the vice president simply acted as president or actually became the president. But John Tyler settled things pretty fast when he boldly declared, "I'm the president now." And everyone just kind of went along with it, making Tyler the first vice president to assume the presidency after a president's death. But it wasn't just VPs who found their way into the Oval Office, because James Polk was the first and only Speaker of the House to become president. But funny enough, that wasn't really why he got elected. Polk also happened to be the first dark horse candidate, a guy nobody expected to win. He was up against the frontrunner Martin Van Buren, and it looked like a long shot. But Polk had one thing working for him: manifest destiny, because he promised to annex Texas, claim Oregon, and stretch America's borders farther than ever. A bold vision that fired up voters and let him pull off the upset, paving the way for this next president, who was about as unconventional as they come, because Zachary Taylor was the first president with no prior elected office, no time in Congress, no stint as governor, not even a town council seat. He was a career general, famous for his victories in the Mexican-American War, and voters loved the idea of a straight-shooting general who can march the nation forward. Until he died in the office from a bad batch of cherries washed in contaminated DC water. I'll be sticking with apples from now on. But this made Millard Fillmore the president, and the first to initiate trade with Japan. Cause in 1852, he dispatched Commodore Matthew Perry across the Pacific to talk trade. No, not that Matthew Perry. And even though Japan lived in isolation from the world for nearly 220 years, Perry's mission worked, because they agreed to open their ports to American ships. Nice to meet you, fellas. Want to try some apple pie? But this next president is the first guy that just had to be different, because Franklin Pierce was the first president to affirm the oath of office instead of swearing it. Really, dude? Well, as a devout Episcopalian, Pierce felt uncomfortable swearing, so he went with, "I do solemnly affirm." And then he doubled down on being one of a kind, because Pierce also became the first president to deliver his entire inaugural address from memory. No notes, no script, just staring straight into the crowd like, "Yeah, I got this." And then there's good old James Buchanan, the first and only president to be a lifelong bachelor. He never married, never had a first lady, and is the only guy to do it solo. And normally, voters like their presidents to be family men. But in the 1850s, the country was tearing apart over slavery, and the people just wanted stability. Unfortunately, Buchanan whiffed at that too, setting the stage for Abraham Lincoln, the first president with a full beard. Cause during his 1860 campaign, an 11-year-old girl encouraged him to grow one, believing it would improve his appearance and help him get more votes. And she was right. 'Cause the beard filled out Abe's long, scrawny face with a wise, statesman-like look. Just in time for the Civil War, when America needed a leader who looked like he could carry the weight of the nation. But suddenly, tragedy struck. 'Cause while watching a play at Ford's Theater, Lincoln was shot and killed by John Wilkes Booth, making him the first president ever assassinated. Rest in peace, sir. But this opened the door to Andrew Johnson, the first president ever impeached, which is basically Congress saying, hey buddy, you broke the rules big time. 'Cause after clashing with radical Republicans over how to rebuild the South, Johnson said, screw this, I'm gonna do what I want, and violated the Tenure of Office Act. So Republicans slapped him with high crimes and misdemeanors and hauled him into an impeachment trial. Still, Johnson narrowly escaped conviction by one vote. Man, you're one lucky dude. But after the craziness of Johnson, America elected a man with stability, Ulysses S. Grant, the first president to graduate from West Point, the United States Military Academy. And it paid off, 'cause it turned this quiet, unassuming guy into the bulldog who crushed the Confederacy. But Grant wasn't just a war hero. He had a soft spot for nature too, 'cause he was also the first president to create a national park, Yellowstone. At a time when America was laying railroad tracks and chopping down forests, Grant protected millions of acres. Thanks for looking out for us, big guy. And hey, since Grant was the first to save Yellowstone, you can be the first to save this channel by hitting that subscribe button. 'Cause I don't want you to disappear, like this next president, who started his presidency in the shadows. 'Cause Rutherford B. Hayes was the first commander-in-chief to take the oath in private. The election of 1876 was razor-thin, and Hayes actually lost the popular vote, but squeaked out an electoral college win by just one elector. The country was furious, and people worried that violence might erupt at his inauguration. So the night before the ceremony, Hayes quietly slipped into the Red Room of the White House and took the oath with just a handful of witnesses. But speaking of a handful, James Garfield was the first ambidextrous president. He could write Latin with one hand and Greek with the other at the same time. Imagine trying to copy homework off of that kid. But this was just a glimpse into Garfield's absurd brainpower, because he was likely the smartest president in U.S. history. Meanwhile, Chester A. Arthur was the first president to enact federal immigration restrictions. In 1882, he signed the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first big law to slam the brakes on immigration. 'Cause out on the West Coast, workers complained that Chinese immigrants were undercutting wages and stealing jobs. So Arthur signed a 10-year ban that shut the door on them completely. And for the first time, the land of opportunity started putting up no entry signs. On the other hand, the White House should have put up a U-turn sign for this next president, because Grover Cleveland was the first president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, making him both the 22nd and 24th president. Proving that losing once doesn't mean your career was toast. But the guy who squeaked between Cleveland's 2 terms was Benjamin Harrison, the first president to have electricity installed in the White House. The only problem, Harrison and his wife were terrified of it. In fact, they were so afraid of being electrocuted, they frequently left the lights on overnight rather than flipping the switch. I'll get that for you, sir. That's why you pay me the big bucks. Afterwards, William McKinley kept the new inventions rolling, because he was the first president to ride in a car. But hold up, don't imagine a Tesla or even a Model T. 'Cause the car was basically a steam-powered wagon mixed with a teapot. But wheels are wheels. Can this thing get up to 60? Whoa! But speaking of traveling far and wide, Teddy Roosevelt was the first sitting president to travel abroad. 'Cause in 1906, he hopped on a ship and headed down to Panama to check out the canal under construction. And in classic Teddy fashion, he tromped around the muddy work site in his white suit and Panama hat, inspecting progress like he owned the place. The trip sent a clear message. America wasn't just building a ditch, it was building an empire. And everyone had to pitch in. But while some presidents like to get their hands dirty, others like to swing a gavel. Like William Howard Taft, the first president to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court after his presidency. 'Cause after leaving office, Taft finally landed the dream job he always wanted, Chief Justice of the United States, making him the only person to run both the executive branch and the judicial branch. But there must have been something in the water back then, because these presidents were brilliant. Like Woodrow Wilson, the first U.S. president with a Ph.D. And after earning his doctorate in political science from Johns Hopkins, Wilson worked as a college professor and became president of Princeton University. This guy was basically professor-in-chief, and he ran the presidency like a seminar, just without the homework. On the other hand, Warren G. Harding was the first president ever heard on the radio, 'cause in 1922, his voice crackled over the airwaves during the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial. And this was a game changer, because the president was no longer just words on a page. He could speak directly to the people. But when Harding dropped dead from a heart attack, Calvin Coolidge became the first president sworn in by his father. 'Cause Silent Cal was up in Vermont relaxing at the family farmhouse when he got the tragic news. And when a president dies, the VP can't waste a second. The oath has to happen right away. But the only problem, there weren't any judges around, no Chief Justice, and no fancy ceremony. So Coolidge turned to his father, a local notary, and basically said, "Hey Pops, mind holding this Bible while I become president?" Talk about a memorable father-son moment. But let's take a trip all the way to Iowa, land of Herbert Hoover, because this guy was the first president born west of the Mississippi River. So why is that a big deal? Well, it showed that America was no longer just an Atlantic coast country, but a continental power stretching from sea to shining sea. And no one represented that better than Hoover himself, an orphan turned self-made multi-millionaire turned president of the United States. Not too bad for a small-town kid. But this next president's first is so crazy, it'll never be replicated again. Because Franklin Roosevelt is the only president elected to more than 2 terms. And it wasn't just 3, it was 4. Back-to-back-to-back-to-back wins from 1932 to 1944. But here's the fascinating part. Up until FDR, no president had gone beyond 2 terms. Not because the Constitution said so, but because George Washington set the tradition. Washington stepped down after 2 terms and everyone just followed that unwritten rule. However, FDR pulled off this anomaly thanks to the turmoil of World War II. But after his death, Congress got together and passed the 22nd Amendment, capping presidents at 2 terms. But this next guy had a first that the entire world is deathly afraid of. Because Harry Truman was the first president to order atomic weapons used in war. In August 1945, with World War II dragging on and Japan refusing to surrender, Truman made the call. Hiroshima first, then Nagasaki, and launched 2 bombs that ended the war and began the nuclear age. A decision that remains one of the most hotly debated moves in presidential history. Because Dwight D. Eisenhower was the first president to serve in both World War I and World War II. During the first one, he trained tank crews in Pennsylvania, and in the second, he was Supreme Allied Commander, the strategist running D-Day, directing armies, and driving Nazi Germany to surrender. So when Ike ran for president in the 1950s, Americans knew exactly what they were getting. A war hero with steady hands. But then came John F. Kennedy, the first president to participate in a televised presidential debate. 'Cause in 1960, the whole country tuned into JFK versus Richard Nixon. And on the radio, listeners thought Nixon held his own. But on TV, it was a whole different story. Kennedy looked cool, confident, and camera-ready, while Nixon looked pale, sweaty, and uncomfortable under the lights. The contrast was so stark, it changed politics forever. Because Kennedy proved that television wasn't just a medium, it was a weapon. But speaking of weapons, after JFK was assassinated, Lyndon B. Johnson became the first and only president sworn in on an airplane. And the scene was unforgettable. Johnson with his hand raised, Jackie Kennedy with her blood-stained pink suit, and the staff crammed into the cabin. This wasn't your average swearing in. It was raw, emotional, and a presidential first. Kinda like Richard Nixon, the first and only U.S. president to resign from office. 'Cause in 1974, The Watergate scandal had him boxed in. Congress was ready to impeach, the evidence was piling up, and Nixon was out of moves. So instead of going down swinging, he saved himself some dignity and stepped down from the highest office in the world. He pulled the classic, "You can't fire me, I quit," leading us to Gerald Ford, the only person to become president without ever winning a presidential or vice presidential election. Wait, how'd you get here? Well, first, Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned in disgrace, so Nixon appointed Ford as VP to replace him. Then Nixon resigned over Watergate, and suddenly Ford became president. No campaign trail, no ballots, just a wild game of political musical chairs. But enough about short-lived presidencies. Let's talk about Jimmy Carter, the first president born in a hospital. Yep, every president before him was a home birth baby. And I think that may have helped out with his health, because Carter later became the first president to live 100 years. My man Jimmy hit triple digits. Meanwhile, Ronald Reagan was the first president to appoint a woman to the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor. And this was a historic step, one that showed America was slowly opening the door to more diversity in its top institutions. But speaking of top jobs, George H.W. Bush was the first president to serve as CIA director. Yep, before the Oval Office, he was running the nation's spy agency. And this gave him a front row seat to global coups, covert ops, and Cold War secrets, which must have helped out because the Soviet Union collapsed during his presidency. They call me Flappy, Agent Flappy. But after Bush came Bill Clinton, the first president to have his inauguration live streamed on the internet. And while most of America was dealing with a clunky desktop and dial-up internet, this was the first major leap into the digital age. Hey, this thing's still buffering. Now, when you get to president number 43, you might be wondering, how the heck are there still presidential firsts happening? But believe it or not, George W. Bush was the first president with a Master of Business Administration degree, an MBA from Harvard. And sure, his old man probably helped him get in there, but Bush still walked out with a diploma of his own. And I'm just sitting here wondering how much that MBA came in handy when faced with 9/11 and the War on Terror. Probably not too much. On the other hand, Barack Obama's presidential first is pretty obvious. He's the first president born in Hawaii, making him the only commander-in-chief from outside the continental US. And, oh yeah, he's also the first African-American president too. A pretty big reflection of America's growing diversity. But speaking of watershed moments, Donald Trump was the first president with zero political or military experience. He wasn't a governor, senator, or even a general. Just a businessman and reality TV star jumping straight into the Oval Office. 'Cause voters got fed up with career politicians and wanted an outsider to shake things up. Until the pendulum swung the other way. 'Cause Joe Biden is pretty much the definition of a career politician. And the first president with over 35 years in the Senate. Sheesh. But Biden's presidency came with another historic first, Kamala Harris, the first female vice president in U.S. history. We did it, Joe! But speaking of presidential firsts, nothing beats uncovering your own family first with MyHeritage. So don't forget to start your 14-day free trial with MyHeritage today by clicking the link below or scanning the QR code on the screen. But if you think that's a big deal, then you've never looked at our president's bank accounts. Because this is every U.S. president's wealth explained. From flying million-dollar private jets, to dying broke in Monticello, to losing your entire life savings in a Ponzi scheme, and then making it all back. Some presidents walked into the White House a lot better than when they came in. So click this video right here and find out who's stacking cash and who's stuck with trash.